Okay, so in the first 4 chapters, we laid the groundwork for analyzing English sentences. In these next 3 chapters, we're going to look at, well, we're going to build on that foundation, but we're also going to look at more complex elements that will help us analyze and make sense of more complex sentences. So when we started off talking about nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Those basic parts of speech that you probably learned about in elementary school. They're pretty straightforward. But we immediately began to complicate that by replacing nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs with nominals, predicates, adjectivals, and adverbials. Now, the difference between these two groups is that the first group refers to types of words, nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, while the second group refers to types of functions. That is, instead of thinking of nouns alone, we'll be thinking of noun functions or nominals. That is, words, phrases, or clauses that perform the function of a noun in a sentence. And likewise, we'll be going beyond just adjectives and adverbs to see how types of words, phrases, or even clauses can perform the functions of adjectives or adverbials. So in short, you'll find that a noun might not be performing the function of a noun at all. It might be performing the function of an adjective. And likewise, the verb phrase might not be the verb of a sentence, but might be the sentence's subject, performing the function of a noun. So when I use the term adverbial, adjectival, or nominal, what I mean is a word, phrase, or clause that is performing the function of an adverb or an adjective or a noun, respectively. Now, it might sound confusing. It's going to make more sense as we go along, but it's also, what makes language so rich and complex is the way in which nouns can function as adverbs and vice versa, okay? So this graph right here lays out all the different types of noun functions we can have: noun words, nominal verb phrases, nominal clauses, appositives, all the different adjectivals and adverbials we can have, whether that's just plain adjective words or phrases or adverbs, but also prepositional phrases, nouns, verb phrases or participial phrases, and then different types of clauses. To kind of, rephrase this, let's look at sentence patterns again. So here we see the basic sentence patterns according to subject, verb, objects, and complements that we've been talking about. Now, here we see those same patterns, but with the different functions required for those parts in parentheses. So this is what I mean when I say, for instance, that a verb phrase or even a clause can function as a noun. The subject has to be a nominal, it has to be some type of kind of noun function, but what counts as a nominal can be of many different types. So you'll notice that except for sentence pattern number 1, there are no adverbials anywhere in these sentence patterns. And there's very few adjectivals, just a couple here and down here. Adverbials and adjectivals are essentially, simply less necessary to a sentence than nominals and verb phrases. Instead, they are usually more optional or are integrated into one of these other parts, whether into the noun, subject, or object, or into the verb phrase, the predicate verb phrase, or what have you. So let's take an example. This is a simple sentence with a single noun and a single intransitive verb. Annie waits. No adjectives, no adverbs, no modifiers. This is a sentence pattern number 4. Now let's add some modifiers to that. I'll describe the diagram up here in a second, but let me just go ahead and read that sentence. In the pouring rain, miserable little Annie, starving and anxious, waits for the bus as cars whiz by and as her hopes of getting home before nightfall slowly dwindle. Now, we still have the exact same sentence pattern. It's still a sentence or a pattern for a sentence. Annie is the subject and waits is the verb, but we've added all these adjectivals and adverbials to modify these. And you can see that here. I've said we started off with an adverbial, then we have a couple of adjectivals, and then another couple of adjectivals, then the verb, and then a series of adverbials. All these add details and descriptions and additional context to our original sentence. So here's that sentence color-coded. Adverbials are in green, adjectives are in pink, with the subject in red and the verb in blue. And notice how the adjectivals are closely connected to the noun phrase that they're modifying, That's a good reminder that adjectivals cannot be moved around as easily as adverbials. The adjectivals modify the noun any, and the adverbials here are modifying how she waits, or the verb. So in this video and chapter, we're going to focus on these adverbials. Now, we'll look at adjectivals next time, and then after that, we'll look at nominals. So adverbials modify almost everything except nouns themselves. They can modify verbs, adverbials, adjectivals, or even entire sentences. We saw this in the last video. We talked about conjunctive adverbs. Adverbials usually tell us where, when, why, how, and how often. Adverbials can be comprised of many different types of words or phrases, as I showed in that table in a few slides earlier. They can be adverbs themselves or adverbial phrases. They could be prepositional phrases. We've talked about that. But they can also be nouns or noun phrases. Verbs or verb phrases can also function as adverbials. And then finally, entire clauses with a subject and predicate and all that can function as an adverbial. All right, so we'll talk about these one by one so that we get a clear sense about all the different types of adverbials there are. Okay, so the simplest one is one that we've basically talked about before. These are adverbials that are comprised of adverb words or phrases. These are the words that often end in ly. And note that while I said that adverbs are more movable than adjectives, it's all relative. Adverbs themselves tend to be less movable than other types of adverbials. So, for instance, the adverb seriously means something very different if you say, I will study seriously tomorrow versus seriously, I will study tomorrow. Or even if you say, I will study tomorrow seriously, in which case it means that you're going to take the concept of tomorrow very seriously. So the word itself can move around, but it changes the meaning more often than other adverbials would. Now, another familiar adverbial is the prepositional phrase, and we saw this all the way back in chapter 1. Remember again that prepositional phrases are comprised of a preposition and a noun phrase and must be either adverbial or adjectival. The adverbial gives gives the reader information like where, when, why, how, and how often. Remember that prepositional phrases, like I said, preposition and a noun phrase. Okay, nouns can also be adverbials. Now, one of the reasons it is key to think in terms of adverbials instead of adverbs is because, as we talked about, different parts of speech can play the part of other parts of speech without changing their form. It's still going to look like a noun, but it's going to be playing the part of an adverb, okay? Now, we often use noun phrases as adverbials when we're trying to indicate when the verb will or has taken place. So, I work every day. Every is actually an adjectival modifier modifying day, but day is a noun, right? It is a thing that can be made plural or possessive. It is indicating when this person works. It's modifying work. Now, note when you're parsing a sentence, it might be difficult to figure out if a noun is functioning as an adverbial or perhaps as the direct object, either of a verb or a preposition, because it's going to look basically the same. Remember that prepositions require nouns as their objects, and certain verbs require direct object nouns as well. So it can be hard to figure out, is this a adverbial noun or is this an object noun? This is especially tricky because in English we have what are called prepositional verbs, and these are verbs that end with a preposition but do not necessarily require a prepositional object. For instance, I'll swing by is an intransitive verb. It doesn't actually require any object, even though by is a preposition. And tomorrow is an adverbial noun indicating when I'll be swinging by. It is not the object of the preposition by. It's simply an optional adverbial. And we know that because we could say tomorrow, comma, I'll swing by. It's movable. But in I'll swing by your house is the direct object to the verb swing by. I couldn't say your house, comma, I'll swing by unless I was Yoda. And the whole point of Yoda, by the way, is that he moves those parts of sentences around that can't be moved around, making him sound either completely wise or incredibly stupid, depending on your opinion of the Star Wars franchise. So the test is, can you move the noun phrase around? If yes, then it's most likely adverbial. Actually, almost certainly adverbial, but maybe don't quote me on that. Okay, now verb phrases can also be adverbials, but there's a couple of key rules. First off, they are always, always, always in the infinitive form. That means they are not tense and that they have the word to before it. So Hamlet famously said to be or not to be. That is the infinitive form. That is not the question, it's the infinitive form. The to before a non-tense verb. Tense verbs are for clauses, and non-tense verbs are for adverbials, adjectivals, or nominals, as we'll see. And adverbial verb phrases can only be in the infinitive form. And the way to identify whether or not a verb phrase is an adverbial versus, say, a nominal is to notice that they always come with an implied in order before them. If you can add that phrase in order to an infinitive verb phrase, you know it's adverbial. So I am studying to be the best student I can. There's an implicit in order. I am studying in order to be the best student I can. So I know that this phrase, to be the best student I can, is an adverbial verb phrase. All right. I can't wait to get to the gym to dance the night away. I can't wait to get to the gym in order to dance the night away. That would make to dance the night away an adverbial verb phrase. And notice we have the infinitive form to dance, just like we have the infinitive form to be up here. Those are untensed verbs. Now remember that while they are not tense, they still technically require a subject, which means that your adverbial verb phrase needs to correspond with the subject of the sentence that they are a part of. So let's look at the struck out sentence. To be the best student possible, SVU has provided everyone with iPads. Now, SVU is not a student. And so thus they could not be the subject of this verb phrase. SVU is not trying to be the best student possible. They are trying to help all of you be the best students possible. So in that case, you have a mix-up of subject and adverbial phrase. Now, finally, and perhaps most importantly, entire clauses can be adverbials. Okay, so let's just kind of clarify what clauses are. I know that we've talked mainly in terms of sentences, and we haven't used the phrase clauses a lot, but it's going to become a lot more important, so we want to be clear about them. Clauses are any groups of words with a subject and a predicate, meaning a tensed verb. So that is a noun phrase plus a verb phrase where the verb is tensed. Now that sounds a lot like a sentence, but while a sentence has to have an independent clause, clauses can also be dependent. That means they can form part of a sentence, but they could not be a sentence all on their own. Dependent clauses come with a subordinating conjunction, some word at the very beginning of the clause indicating that they are dependent and not independent, and that connect them to that independent clause. And along with that subordinating conjunction, they also have a subject and a predicate, just like any other independent clause would. And likewise, dependent clauses also fit one of the 7 sentence patterns, even though that they cannot exist on their own as a sentence. So notice that distinction between a coordinating conjunction and a subordinating conjunction. A coordinating conjunction is to coordinate 2 independent clauses, 2 possible sentences into one sentence. A subordinating conjunction is to make one clause dependent on another independent clause, such that it could not be on a sentence on its own. So you'll notice then that the defining difference between a dependent and independent clause is that dependent clause comes with that coordinating conjunction. And if you remove that, it's actually going to look just like an independent clause. So it's that conjunction where you have all the difference. These are words like when, after, before, once, as soon, though, although, if, because, just as if, whereas, and so forth. Now, the stylistic purpose of adverbial clauses is that it allows us to provide additional contextual information for the independent clause. So take these examples. While I was walking to the park, I saw a man stumbling along the road. Even though I was in a hurry, I went over and asked if he needed help. Now, the dependent adverbial clauses at the beginning of each of these sentences provides additional information to where I was in my state of mind when I saw the man and went to help him. It allows me to give a little extra piece of detail, but without distracting from the main independent clause that I want to get across. Okay, now punctuating these clauses. You place commas at the beginning and at the end, unless of course it starts a sentence. You never put a comma at the very beginning of a sentence. So you would just put it at the end of the opening dependent clause. This helps to set the clause off as dependent and separate from the main independent clause. And often they can go almost anywhere in a sentence because of that. However, when a dependent clause ends a sentence and provides essential information, it does not take a comma. Now, essential here is somewhat subjective. So let me just say that in general, you do not put a comma before dependent clauses at the end of a sentence. Okay, in general, if you have a dependent clause at the end of your sentence, there's no comma involved. I say in general because there are several exceptions, but you can kind of start from that general rule. Okay, finally, elliptical clauses. Actually, let me pause here and let me come back to this in a second. Okay, so with elliptical adverbial clauses, as I said before, adverbial verb phrases take the sentence's subject as its own subject. So you want to make sure that they actually match up. But sometimes we will write elliptical adverbial clauses where we omit the subject of our dependent clause. And when we do this, we are implicitly taking the subject of the independent clause to be the subject of our dependent clause. Okay, so essentially we're just kind of dropping the subject from the wording of our dependent clause, assuming that the reader will pick up that we're using the same subject as the independent clause. But like with adverbial verb phrases, the key is to make sure that the implied subject of our elliptical clauses actually do match up with the subject of our independent clause. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples. The one that struck out is incorrect. While waiting for the bus, the police pulled over to ask us what we were doing on the side of the road. Now, the police is the subject of the independent clause. This is the elliptical clause. It's an adverbial elliptical clause, while waiting for the bus. While is a subordinating conjunction, making it a dependent clause. Waiting is technically not a tense verb, and that's because we've dropped the subject. So it's a non-tense verb, a gerund. We'll talk about that later. But it's the verb for this dependent clause. But notice that we don't have a subject. That's kind of all I wanted to get at. And because we don't have a subject here, the reader is going to assume that, hold on. Okay, crisis averted. Let me just kind of remind myself where we were. While waiting for the bus, the police pulled over to ask us what we were doing on the side of the road. And as we pointed out, there is no subject in this elliptical clause. It is implied, but it's implied to be the police, which makes no logical sense. So this is why this sentence has a serious problem. You either want to add the subject to the sentence, and we could say, while we waited for the bus, or you need to change the subject of the independent clause to match the implied subject of the elliptical clause. While waiting for the bus, we were questioned by the police, who asked what we were doing on the side of the road. Now, you might be wondering, wait a minute, what's this kind of final clause here? Is this an adverbial clause? It's not. It's actually an adjectival clause. We're going to talk about that next time. Let's look at a few examples here. So we're going to underline all the adverbial structures in the following sentences. And when structures are embedded within others, you'll have to underline them twice. Then identify the form of each, whether it's an adverb phrase, a noun phrase, a prepositional phrase, etc., and then identify the kind of information it provides, time, frequency, duration, place, and so forth. This is going to ask us, I'm just looking up the exercise here to make sure I got all of it. Actually, I didn't. Let me pause and add the other questions real quick. Okay, there we go. So we're basically looking at these different sentences and figuring out, oops, fix that. You're getting a little peek behind the curtain, as it were. Okay. And let's figure out what types of adverbials we have here and what their function is and how we identify them. So you will be doing the odd numbers. I'm going to do the even numbers with you. After my dad came home from abroad, he started his own business. He is the subject of my sentence. Started is the verb. What did he start? His own business is the direct object. So there's no adverbials here, but we have this dependent clause here at the start. After is a subordinating conjunction, and then we have the subject of that sentence, my dad, and then we have the rest of it here. Came home from abroad. And yeah, from abroad is definitely an adverbial prepositional phrase. What I'm thinking about here is came an intransitive verb that does not require an object, in which case home would be an adverbial noun, or is this a transitive verb that requires a direct object and is home that verb? Let me think about that for a second. My dad came home. Yeah, it would have to be direct object. So this is not an adverbial noun, it is just a direct object. Complement to came, okay? That's number 2. All right, so by the way, we have, do we get everything? I guess, what type of information does it provide? It provides, geez, I can't really think off the top of my head. After my dad came home from abroad, he started his own. It's basically kind of telling a narrative. It's sort of a narrative sequence. So I guess that's time. Number 4, while the wind howled, we prepared to leave. Now, to leave is the infinitive form. We have the to and then the non-tense verb, and we can put an implied in order here. We prepared in order to leave. So this is an adverbial verb phrase. Here we have another dependent clause with a comma at the end. While is the subordinate conjunction. While the wind howled. No other adverbials here because this is the subject and this is the verb of that subordinating clause. This is telling us, I guess, duration while this happened. I don't know that I necessarily remember what they mean by those terms exactly. So I'm just going to give it our best shot. All right, let's look at number 6 on the next slide. Because the weather was unseasonably warm, people flocked to the beaches. Now, we have to be careful. We have to here, which we might think is part of the, oh, I'm not sure what happened there. I think I hit the wrong key. Let's try this. There we go. To, we might think is part of the infinitive form, but we are not followed with a verb. We're followed with a noun, the beaches, a noun phrase. So this is actually a preposition. So we have to think, is this an adjectival or a prepositional, excuse me, is this an adjectival or an adverbial prepositional phrase? And it's adverbial because it's modifying to where they flocked. Then we have this dependent clause here, because the weather was unseasonably warm. The weather is the subject of that dependent clause. Was is the verb. Because is the subordinating conjunction, and it's telling us reason. Finally, the crew departed late Monday night and arrived early Tuesday morning. There are no dependent clauses in here. This is just all one independent clause. The crew being the subject, departed being the verb. Now, what is all this? Well, these are all noun phrases, right? Late Monday night, early Tuesday morning. I guess arrived is a coordinated verb, so that's also part of the predicate. This is an adverbial noun phrase telling us when they departed and when they arrived. And as I said, noun phrases, adverbial noun phrases usually have to do with when something is happening or did happen. So that's what those adverbials are doing. They're noun phrases telling us a certain moment in time. It says to further practice with adverbials, you could change the form of the adverbial. Yeah, we're not going to do that. All right. So if you have any questions, do let me know. Otherwise, this covers it for adverbials. We'll be practicing this. So if you feel overwhelmed, don't worry. We will work on this more, and then we will add adjectivals to this. See you next time.